I still remember the tremor beneath my feet before I even saw them. The ground vibrated like the planet itself had decided to rise against me. At first, I thought it was just another minor quake. Settlement life on Shakor 7 often came with such tremors, but the stench hit me before I understood the horror. Burning metal, scorched flesh, and the sour, oily scent of Ork machinery. Name's Kalen Varric, I whispered to myself, more to hold on to who I still was than to anyone else. My arms were yanked backward by massive green hands, nails jagged, knotted, and blackened, digging into my flesh. The Orks didn't speak like humans. They bellowed and roared, a chorus of guttural laughter and savage command that rolled across the valley, rattling my bones. Behind them surged a tide of muscle, tusks, and iron. I glimpsed other humans, men, women, even children, shoved forward like cattle, their faces frozen in terror, some silent, some screaming, none able to understand the fate awaiting them. I stumbled over jagged ruins, splintered wood, and crushed stone beneath my feet. Fires the Orks had set burned low, consuming homes and scattering molten shards that hissed when they met the dirt. The ground was slick with blood, oil, and ash. Every step reminded me that this was no ordinary raid. This was war, Ork war, methodical, chaotic, and merciless. Above me, the war boss roared, a sound without joy, only domination. Its laughter shook the earth. Knobs barked orders, electrified prods striking those who moved too slowly. I realized, with a sinking horror, that we were not prisoners in the conventional sense. We were resources, fuel for war, tools for their amusement and appetite. Chains bit into my wrists, twisted iron and leather that cut through skin but could not restrain terror. Around me, humans huddled together, pressing backs, whispering names like prayers. I clung to mine, Kalen Varric. A name that meant nothing to the Orks, a name that might soon be the only remnant of my existence. By nightfall, the camp revealed itself. Furnaces, jagged metal, belt-driven engines, and primitive catapults everywhere. Humans were laboring under constant threat, hauling scrap, tending fires, digging trenches. One mistake, one glance in the wrong direction, and death came with merciless speed. I lay on the scorched earth, chains clinking, trying to grasp a fragment of sanity. Fear was constant, an instrument of survival. Those who forgot it even for a moment were dead. And yet, in that chaos, a spark remained. The realization that surviving, even in this hell, demanded breath, demanded movement, demanded living. Not hope, not heroism, just survival. That first night, I learned the laws of Ork slavery. You are nothing. You are expendable. You exist only to serve the whims of the green tide. And if you survive, you learn the second law. Your body, mind, and eventually your soul are never fully your own again. I am Kalen Varric. And as the first rays of a blood-red sun fell across the war camp, I understood. Survival would demand the surrender of everything I once was. I am Kalen Varric. That name matters little here, yet it is the only thing I have left that belongs to me. They dragged me from my home, my village of Eldon's Hollow, on the outskirts of the Garrick Plains, some 50 kilometers from the nearest Imperial outpost. The Orks came like a green storm, roaring, howling, their boots thudding through the wooden homes, axes swinging, teeth flashing. Smoke and fire devoured the streets. I remember the first scream I heard, the body of old Marek, our blacksmith, crushed beneath the boot of a knob. That sound etched itself into my bones. The war camp sprawls across a plateau about 2 kilometers wide, bounded by jagged scrap walls 20 meters high, reinforced with broken chimera hulls and twisted metal beams. The air is thick with the stench of oil, scorched metal, and blood. The ground is churned mud and crushed stone, littered with the remnants of destroyed vehicles and the bodies of humans too slow or too unlucky to survive their first day. I have learned the layout quickly, not because of maps, they exist only in my head, but because survival depends on it. I must know where the big mechs patrol, where the knobs choose to execute, where the Gretchen huddle with their tools to swing at anyone who falters. Every morning, I awaken to the same cacophony, the grinding of gears in the whack. Engines, the bellowing laughter of a knob over some freshly broken slave, the shrieks of Gretchen enforcing order. My task is simple yet exhausting, hauling scrap metal from the northern scrapyard, a kilometer trek across mud, smoke and filth, to the central forge where the big mech Zagrith and his entourage repair and modify their war machines. If I stumble, if the load tilts, if a piece of scrap clatters, he notices. His single glance, gleaming with malicious curiosity, is enough to make me drop everything and crawl back under his boot in apology. The big mechs tower above all, their arms like steel-hardened trees. Zagrith's favorite toy is the Whack engine, a massive contraption of iron, pistons and screaming fire. Feeding it is a perilous duty. One false step and the molten fuel sprays in arcs, singeing flesh, searing screams into the air. I've seen 3 men consumed in 1 minute, their screams swallowed by the engine's roar. The knobs enforce discipline. Tusker, the one with the jagged tusks, strikes without warning. Sometimes it is for disobedience, sometimes it is simply for his amusement. I have learned to keep my head low, my hands moving faster than thought, my body a blur between survival and exhaustion. The Gretchen are smaller but no less dangerous. They scuttle along the edge of the labor grounds with sharpened rods, sticks and crude knives, looking for any mistake. Their small size hides their lethal intent. One jab to the ankle, one bite and you fall to the mud, your screams swallowed by the chaos around you. Even when you follow instructions perfectly, the Gretchen may decide you are slow and mark you for punishment. Obedience is not enough. You must anticipate, outpace and sometimes deceive these creatures, lest they remind you of your place. Disposable, insignificant, human. Food is a luxury of fear. Each day we gather scraps, gruel laced with fat, burnt meat and grit. Eating too slowly, speaking out of turn, or catching the wrong orc's gaze can earn a flogging or worse. Water is rationed, mostly to prevent fainting rather than to sustain. Heat from fires and the relentless sun beats down, cracking lips, blistering skin, but we cannot stop. To stop is to die. Even sleep offers no reprieve. The night is alive with shadows, silhouettes of towering knobs, the clatter of Gretchen patrols, and the occasional flare of fire as punishment is delivered for some imagined misstep. The psychological toll is relentless. I am a ghost of my former self, counting the minutes until the next threat, replaying screams, memorizing every Orcish sound, every twitch, every laugh. Every day, I weigh my name against the possibility of death. Every hour, I measure the distance to the nearest patrol, the time until my next labor, the heat of molten scrap. My mind is sharpened by terror, my body is battered by work. I have seen humans broken physically and mentally, reduced to empty shells who will obey even as they are dismembered. I am terrified of becoming one of them. Yet even here, among mud, fire and screaming, I grasp at small victories. I memorize patrol routes. I learn which knob has a short fuse, which big mech enjoys watching others fail. I note which Gretchen is slow, which is quick, which can be bribed with scraps or deception. Knowledge is survival. Observation is survival. And I cling desperately to my name, Kalen Varric. The one thing that remains undeniably human, even as every other piece of my life has been claimed by these green monsters. This is life in the Orc war camp. Labor without reprieve, fear without pause, survival without dignity. Every day I learn the rules, or perhaps the illusions of rules, and navigate them as best I can. Every moment is a negotiation with death. Every breath is borrowed. And through it all, I remind myself, I am Kalen Varric, human, and I will find some way to endure. The air was heavy with smoke and iron, acrid and clinging to my nostrils. My hands were raw from hauling scrap, blistered from the weight of metal that seemed to grow heavier with every step. I had learned the rhythms of the camp, the measured chaos, the patterns of terror. But nothing could have prepared me for what I witnessed that day. It began with Jaren, a boy no older than 15 by my reckoning, one of the newer captives, trembling as he fumbled with the fuel hose for the Whack engine. The big mech, Zagrith, had been impatient that morning, pacing atop a mound of scrap like some green god of mischief. His tusks gleamed in the harsh sunlight, and his eyes, tiny and black as coal, darted across the labor field, searching for amusement. Jaren dropped the hose. A single misstep. A slip. A failure so minor, so human, it barely registered in my mind. But Zagrith saw it. With a roar that shook the iron and mud beneath my boots, he pointed his massive soot-stained finger. Boy no good. Waste of scrap. Smash him. The Gretchen around him scurried like vermin, sharpening hooks and crude blades. Jaren froze, his wide eyes locking on mine for a moment that felt like a lifetime. There was no escape. Not for him, not for any of us. The first strike came from a knob named Tusker. His massive, jagged cleaver swung down in a deadly arc. The sound, it's a noise I will never forget. Metal ripping flesh, the sickening squelch of bone and sinew, followed by Jaren's scream, a high-pitched, echoing note that seemed to linger in the air like smoke. The other slaves dropped to their knees, faces pressed to the mud, silent prayers or silent cries, I could not tell which. My stomach turned violently. The smell, blood, burned hair, molten metal, was overwhelming. It coated my tongue and my throat with iron and smoke. The screams of Jaren were punctuated by the barked orders of Zagreth and the cruel laughter of the surrounding orcs. They were enjoying it, watching, anticipating every twitch of fear, every sound of agony. There was no malice in their enjoyment. It was a ritual, a lesson, a game. Violence is their currency, their humor, their justice. As Jaren was torn apart, limb by limb, I felt a cold, creeping realization. This was no longer a camp of labor. It was a theater of despair. Every act of punishment was meant to remind us of our place. Insignificant, expendable, human only in form, not in worth. The orcs do not kill for anger. They kill for amusement, for discipline, for tradition. To them, our screams are music, our pain a narrative, our failures worthy of spectacle. I wanted to scream, to rush forward, to intervene. But the sheer size of Zagreth, the presence of Tusker, the horde of Gretchen surrounding the laborers, and the sharp smell of burning metal that accompanied the whack engine held me frozen. My hands clenched in the mud, the dirt biting under my nails as helplessness threatened to consume me. I was alive only because I had learned to obey, to anticipate, to be invisible. Survival was a cruel lottery. Luck, timing, and the perception of usefulness determined who lived another day. After what seemed like an eternity, the orcs lost interest. Tusker tossed Jaren's remains aside, and the Gretchen scuttled back to their posts. Zagreth turned his attention to something shiny glinting in the mud, an abandoned power conduit, and moved off, roaring in delight, leaving the rest of us to continue our work as if nothing had happened. The guilt pressed down on me as I lifted another jagged piece of scrap. My body obeyed the rhythm I had learned: lift, carry, stack, repeat. My mind, however, was a storm of rage, terror, and shame. How could survival mean anything when every day demanded the sight of such atrocities? When every act of existence in the camp required me to suppress outrage, to suppress humanity, to mimic the submission of the broken. I realized something vital that day: orcs do not care for reason, for fairness, or for morality. To understand them is to understand survival. Violence is their language and they speak it fluently. Every punishment, every death, every scream is a lesson to those who remain. Adapt, obey, anticipate, or perish. That night, under a sky orange with smoke and reflected fire, I lay on the mud floor with Jaren's memory seared into my vision. I traced the edges of the scrap I carried, feeling the weight of my insignificance. I whispered my name to the darkness, Kalen Varric. Clinging to it was the only way to remember I was human. The camp would try to strip me of that, of my identity, of my hope. But I would fight in the smallest ways, by remembering, by observing, by surviving. Because in an orc war camp, survival is the only form of resistance, and witnessing the horrors is the price of remaining alive. The dawn in the orc war camp never arrives with gentle light or calm. The sky is a permanent haze of smoke, the sun a dull, angry orb barely piercing the cloud of soot and ash. The ground itself seems to burn, cracked from the heat of molten scrap and fires the orcs never bother to extinguish. Every morning, the wake-up is not the call of birds, but the bellow of knobs or the sharp clang of mech tools against metal. The day begins with chains and commands. We are herded like animals, slaves pressed into line, eyes down, backs bent, fingers scorched by hot metal and tools too heavy for human hands. My body remembers every strike, every lash, every stumble in the mud. We carry scrap from the outer dumps, twisted metal, shattered hulls of vehicles, remnants of battles that mean nothing to the orcs. Each piece is a weight not only on our shoulders but on our souls. The sound of grinding gears and roaring engines is a constant drumbeat, a reminder that the camp is alive and it feeds on us. The whack machines, the hulking contraptions of crude engineering, stand like monuments to orc ingenuity and malice. They hiss and sputter, belching fire and molten metal, demanding fuel and attention. It falls to us, the humans, to feed them, scrape the residue, cool the overheated joints, and pray that a single misstep doesn't earn a boot to the skull or worse. Rogue orcs wander between the machines, their laughter a high-pitched, terrifying cadence that can break the strongest spirit. One wrong glance, one accidental misstep, and their cleaver or clawed hand could claim you as easily as snapping a twig. The mud, mixed with oil and ash, glues to our boots, to our skin. Hands blister from hauling hot metal. Back aches from bending beneath scrap piles taller than a man. The air burns with the smell of ozone, melted plastic, and the unending stench of blood from past executions. Each step is a battle against exhaustion, and each breath tastes of smoke and despair. And yet, within the fatigue, the mind wanders. I remember my family. The smell of home, of warm bread and rain on stone streets. I see faces that no longer exist, children whose laughter is now silent, streets now nothing but rubble or distant memory. These moments pierce the endless toil like a knife through fabric. They remind me of who I was, who I might have been, and yet the camp's reality crushes that identity with every second. Sometimes we are sent to dig trenches or fortify walls, shovels heavy, the sun a cruel glare through the hazy smoke. My arms ache, my fingers bleed. Around me, other slaves move in unison, each one a ghost of a life that used to matter. I watch a young boy, no older than 14, drop his load and weep. An orc nob sees this and laughs, sending a boot flying into the boy's ribs. He cries out, gasps, then continues. That is survival here. To move, to obey, to exist just enough to not be noticed, not enough to be killed. There are fire pits where orcs roast scraps of metal, testing their temper, and sometimes tossing the unlucky into the flames for fun. Molten scrap drips onto the ground, sizzling when it strikes the mud, releasing acrid smoke that stings the lungs. These fires are constant companions, painting the camp in harsh, orange light, casting shadows that twist across the laboring humans like specters. The orcs see these shadows and laugh. We see them and know they are warnings, reminders that the camp is alive, watching, judging, ready to punish. I sometimes catch myself whispering my own name, as if remembering it can remind me of my humanity. I am Kalen Varric, I say under my breath, gripping a chunk of molten scrap, ignoring the blistering heat. I am Kalen, a human, a man who once had a life outside this nightmare. But the name feels thin like smoke in my mouth. It is the only tether to sanity, a fragile line connecting me to something beyond the camp's walls, beyond the roar of orcs, beyond the endless labor that defines each day. The internal conflict gnaws at me as much as the physical strain. Part of me wants to give in, to let the chains define me, to become invisible, a shadow moving in the service of orc whims. Another part rebels, a flicker of pride and memory, whispering that to survive, I must not lose myself completely. That even in toil, in suffering, in the mud and blood, I must remember that I am still human, that I still think, that I still feel. And so the day stretches endlessly. The hours are a single grinding movement. Haul, scrape, feed, dig, dodge, obey. No one counts the time. There is no night, not truly. The fires never die. The orcs never rest. They are as eternal as the mud, as the smoke, as the crushing weight of our insignificance. But through it all, in the darkest corners of my mind, I hold on to those memories of freedom, of life before the chains. Even in the endless grind of the war camp, when sweat stings my eyes and the weight of molten scrap bends my back nearly to breaking, there are moments, flickers like sparks in the smoke, that remind me we are still human. It is in these rare instances that I see defiance, fragile and dangerous, taking shape in the heart of the camp. I first noticed it when Yarrick, a fellow laborer from the northern settlement, began to disappear for moments that seemed impossibly long in the chaos of the WAC machine yards. At first I thought he was simply slacking, slipping away from the orc gaze. But then I saw him, crouched behind a pile of molten debris, hands moving quickly, almost reverently, over the gears and conduits of a massive scrap-fueled engine. He was hiding something, or perhaps altering it. One small wrench, one valve, a bolt slightly loosened, imperceptibly different from the day before. The act itself was laughably small to an outsider. A human sabotaging the machinery of gods among orcs might seem meaningless. But to us it was monumental. Each subtle adjustment, each quiet theft of a tool, was a rebellion, a whisper of a life no orc could erase. I watched him with a mixture of awe and terror. Awe, because in the midst of the filth, heat and cruelty, he still dared to act with intention, with purpose beyond survival. Terror because we both knew the stakes. One slip, one misstep, one suspicious glance from a wandering knob or mech and Yarrick, or I for that matter, would be torn apart in seconds. Orcs do not forgive curiosity. They do not forgive deviation. Even the smallest act of resistance is a death sentence unless it is perfectly concealed. I felt something stir in my chest, a sensation I had almost forgotten. Hope. The tiniest ember of it. Seeing Yarrick defy the orcs, if only for a moment, reminded me that our spirits are not yet fully broken. I began to look for opportunities myself, to act subtly where I could. A lever nudged slightly the wrong way, a bucket of molten scrap misdirected to cover a hazard, a tool quietly stashed under the pile of rubble for later use. Each act was meaningless in the grand calculus of the camp, but for us, it was survival of the mind if not the body. And yet, with every spark of rebellion came terror. The Orks' attention is a living, unpredictable force. One moment, a knob could be laughing with some grotesque fascination at the human efforts. The next, the laughter becomes a roar, a boot smashing into ribs, a cleaver swinging for a perceived slight. I learned to move like shadows, to breathe in the rhythm of the machines, to count every step, every glance, every twitch of an Ork's eye. But the spark was intoxicating. In the dim, flickering light of the campfires, I would steal moments to imagine what freedom could look like again. I would whisper plans to myself that might never be acted upon, dreams that the Orks would crush in an instant if discovered. And yet, these moments of defiance reminded me, survival is not merely existing. Survival is remembering who you are, even when the world seeks to grind that identity into dust. Jarek's acts of subtle sabotage became a code of resilience among a handful of us. We did not speak openly, Ork ears are everywhere, but our eyes met, brief nods acknowledging tiny victories. A spark extinguished today might be fanned into flame tomorrow. And in a camp that thrives on violence, fear, and oppression, even the smallest human defiance carries more weight than any weapon the Orks wield. It was here, in these fleeting acts of resistance, that I realized something essential. The Orks can take our bodies, our freedom, our families, our homes, but they cannot yet fully take our will. That flicker of rebellion, fragile and fleeting, becomes our heartbeat. It reminds us that though chains bind our hands, fear binds our minds, there remains a part of us that refuses to be broken. And as I returned to the molten scrap, the blinding sun of the smog-filled sky burning my skin, I carried that spark with me. I carried it not as a weapon against the Orks, they are too vast, too brutal, but as a weapon against despair. And in this hell of heat, smoke, and green-shrouded chaos, that is the only weapon we truly possess. At first, I thought survival meant hiding, keeping my head down, and obeying blindly. But the longer I lived among the Orks, the more I realized that ignorance is as deadly as disobedience. To survive, I had to see through their green, grotesque exterior, to understand the rhythm of their madness, the logic of their chaos. The first time I watched a Wak assembly, I nearly vomited from the stench of oil, blood, and unwashed flesh. The war boss, a hulking monstrosity named Grotmuk Skullcrusher, stood atop a pile of scrap and human bodies, bellowing commands that echoed across the camp like the roar of a living volcano. The knobs behind him snarled in approval, clanging their weapons together and stamping their feet, while the mech boys tinkered feverishly with engines, guns, and explosives, muttering in guttural tongues I could barely comprehend. Even the Gretchen, those cowardly little scuttling creatures, had a purpose, running errands, hauling scrap, and screaming in panic when kicked. I began to notice patterns. The Warboss's attention is absolute. One wrong glance, one hesitation in your movement, and your life could end. The knobs are his lieutenants, brutal and unpredictable, each one guarding a piece of the Warboss's favor. Mechboys maintain the Wak. Engines and weapons, their creations unpredictable but devastating. They are revered and feared in equal measure. A malfunction in a mech's creation is usually blamed on the nearest human slave. Observing the Orks became a survival strategy. I watched which knobs were crueler, which mechboys were distracted by their own devices, and which Gretchen would distract a pursuing Ork while I slipped past. Every day I learned more about the structure of their society, not the polite, orderly hierarchy of the Imperium, but something raw, violent, and unyielding. Grotmuk Skullcrusher ruled by fear and by spectacle. If a slave failed at a simple task, the punishment was brutal and public, a lesson to the rest of us. If an Ork was displeased with a mechboy's creation, the mech was often torn apart, sometimes with us nearby to help in the work. I saw the way the Orks laughed, high-pitched, guttural, utterly alien. Their laughter was not joy but dominance. Understanding it, I realized, was as important as breathing. I began to memorize battle cries and warnings. Whack means charge, yes, but it also carries the weight of approval and power. Smash doesn't just mean to hit, it's both encouragement and threat. Even the smallest Ork grunt, with a crude weapon in hand, could end your life if you misread its intent. Learning these signs became a daily obsession, a way to predict danger before it struck. I also began to see their rituals. When the Orks gathered for a feast, it was chaos incarnate. They tore meat from carcasses, human or otherwise, with no hesitation. Blood was spilled, and the strongest drank first, asserting dominance. I realized that to the Orks, strength is worship. Violence is communication. Survival is performance. Every movement I made had to acknowledge their power. Every action had to show obedience without inviting cruelty. And yet, understanding them did not change my status. I was still a tool, a slave, a creature to be used, beaten, or executed at whim. Knowledge might delay death, but it could never buy freedom. I could predict when a war boss would lash out, when a knob would stomp past, when a mech boy would turn away in concentration. But these small advantages only gave me moments, not liberty. Through observation, I began to see the terrifying brilliance in their madness. Orks are crude, loud, violent, but they are also adaptive. They form armies that overwhelm even the most disciplined humans. They build machines from scrap and bones that function perfectly. They organize raids with an instinctual understanding of strategy that defies their apparent savagery. Survival in their camp is about more than hiding. It is about seeing the logic in chaos, the method in the madness, the hierarchy in the violence. And so, I learned to watch, to listen, to anticipate. I memorized which knobs were prone to tantrums, which war boss was mercurial, which mech boy was careless with his engines. I learned the sounds that signaled an incoming raid, the subtle gestures that meant favor or doom. I became a shadow among the green tide, alive because I understood them. But understanding them is no salvation. Knowledge does not earn respect. It does not grant mercy. It only gives you a fraction of a second to react, a narrow margin between life and the orc boot, the cleaver, the shoulda. Every day I remind myself that I am nothing but a tool. Yet, even in that truth, the act of comprehension, the ability to see their world as they see it, becomes its own kind of power. It is the difference between being dead before they notice and being alive long enough to plan the next subtle act of survival. In the end, the orcs are monsters, but monsters with rules. And in the heart of the heartless, understanding their rules is the only way to keep breathing, to keep moving, to keep a fragment of yourself intact. The morning air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning timber. The orcs were restless. Something in the camp vibrated with the anticipation of violence. I, Kalen Varric, along with the other human slaves, was herded toward the edge of the settlement, chains rattling, feet dragging in the mud. The ground itself seemed to shudder under the thunderous march of Grotmuk Skullcrusher's army, and in the distance I could see the massive silhouettes of trucks rolling over the hills, their engines belching black smoke. This was no drill. The orcs were preparing for another raid, and we were to serve as pack animals, cannon fodder, and unwilling participants. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a drum of terror. I had learned by now that hesitation was punished, and yet, as we neared the first settlement, I felt frozen, overwhelmed by the scale of the destruction I was about to witness and help facilitate. The initial clash was horrifying. Flames consumed entire buildings in seconds, their heat so intense that it singed my eyelashes and scorched the edges of my vision. The screams of civilians, women, men, children, echoed across the plains, mingling with the guttural war cries of the orcs. They were indiscriminate, laughing at every death, smashing anything that moved with a ferocity that defied comprehension. I stumbled over bodies, my chains dragging across scorched soil, as orc knobs kicked and prodded us into hauling weapons, ammo, and supplies to the front lines. I caught sight of a human family fleeing toward a collapsed wall. Before I could even think to help, a knob swung a massive cleaver, cutting down a man mid-step. The woman screamed, the child's cry piercing my chest like a sharpened knife. And I, chained, watched, helpless, was forced to carry crates of ammunition directly into the carnage, my hands slick with sweat and blood, the heat of the fires reflecting the burning shame that coursed through me. Survival demanded obedience, but obedience demanded complicity. I hated myself in that moment more than I had ever hated anyone or anything. Each action I took to preserve my life, the lifting of heavy crates, the steadying of whack engines, the quick movement out of harm's way, felt like betrayal. I was complicit in murder, a participant in a performance of death, and yet I had no choice. The orcs did not negotiate, they did not reason. They only crushed and laughed. The battle escalated further when a war track burst through a wooden barricade. Slaves were pushed in front to clear debris, to direct its path. I felt the vibration in my chest as it charged past, hurling bodies aside like rag dolls. The smell of scorched flesh, the metallic tang of blood, the roar of orc guns, all combined into a sensory symphony of terror. My stomach churned. My hands shook as I worked, each task a desperate act of survival amidst horror. Some slaves had begun to snap under the strain. I saw one boy, no older than 14, frozen in fear as a knob approached. The orc kicked him violently and he fell, a scream swallowed by the chaos. Another slave, attempting to drag an injured civilian to safety, was pulled back by a mech, who smashed a crude wrench across his legs, laughing as the human writhed. The lessons of survival were clear. Hesitation equals pain, action equals temporary reprieve, compliance equals life, barely. Yet even as fear coursed through me, a flicker of something else ignited: rage. Rage at the Orks, at their brutality, at the helplessness imposed on me. I wanted to fight, to resist, to turn my chains against them, but I knew that impulse would be my death. Instead, I channeled that fury into focus, into observation. I memorized patterns of movement, noted the Orks who were reckless, the gaps in their ranks, the moments when their attention faltered. Every act of precision became a survival tactic, each small insight a weapon in a war I could not openly fight. The raid culminated in chaos unlike anything I had witnessed before. Explosions tore the earth apart, roofs collapsed on unsuspecting civilians, and fire spread like wildfire. The Orks shrieked in delight, hacking, shooting, and stamping down anything that resisted. I carried supplies directly through the inferno, dodging debris and bodies, my lungs filled with smoke, my heart heavy with guilt. I realized then that survival here was not about strength or skill, it was about mental endurance, the ability to act while terror and revulsion clawed at your mind. When the dust and smoke finally began to settle, the settlement was no more than smoldering ruins. I sank to my knees, shaking, tears running down my face, my hands blackened with soot and blood. I had survived, but at what cost? Each life lost, each scream, each act of cruelty I had witnessed. These images would haunt me forever. The Orks had taught me a cruel lesson. To live is to participate in their terror, and to resist is to die. I looked around at the other human slaves. Some were crying, some silent, some laughing in nervous disbelief at their continued existence. We were shadows of ourselves, forced into complicity, our souls fractured. And yet, in the wreckage of despair, a tiny ember of defiance remained. A thought, fleeting and dangerous: survive, yes, but do not forget. Remember everything. The horror could teach us as much as the terror itself. That day, I learned the essence of Ork raids. Chaos is law, brutality is entertainment, and humans are nothing but tools. Tools that bleed, scream, and break, yet remain desperately necessary to fuel the green tide. Survival is not freedom, but it is a start. Days and nights bled into one another in the Ork war camp. I, Kalen Varric, could no longer tell if it was morning or evening. The fires burned continuously, the smell of burning flesh, molten scrap, and crude oil never leaving my nostrils. Sleep was a luxury I had long since abandoned, or rather, it was taken from me. The Orks cared nothing for human circadian rhythms. We were woken by the stomping of Nob's boots, the laughter of mechs, or the shrill shrieks of the Gretchen, each sound a hammer pounding against the fragile walls of my mind. Malnutrition gnawed at my bones. My stomach was a hollow drum, yet every morsel of gruel I was given seemed tainted with soot and metal. I could feel my strength ebbing, my fingers trembling as I hauled scrap and fed the Waak engines. My reflection in the murky pools of water around the camp startled me, a face gaunt, eyes hollow, cheeks sunken, lips cracked. Was this really me? Or was it some twisted human-shaped vessel, carrying only the memory of a man? Hallucinations began as whispers at the edges of my consciousness. I saw civilians fleeing the settlements of my past, their faces warped in terror. I could smell the smoke of burning homes, the stench of blood in streets I would never see again. Sometimes I thought I could hear the voices of the dead slaves calling my name, accusing me of cowardice and complicity. The line between memory and reality blurred. I started seeing Gretchen scuttling in corners that held no shapes, hearing Ork laughter echo in tunnels that didn't exist. My own heartbeat became a drum of panic, too fast, too loud, reminding me I was still alive. But at what cost? I caught myself speaking aloud, murmuring half-formed words of defiance or prayer, only to realize the Orks did not understand, nor did they care. Silence was impossible. Stillness was impossible. Every second, a Nob or mech would appear, demanding work, punishing hesitation, rewarding speed with brutal indifference. My mind began fracturing, slipping into a rhythm of hyper-awareness and dissociation. I watched myself move through tasks, my body functioning as though I were already dead. Was this survival, or merely an extension of the Orks' machinery, a human automaton executing their whims? And yet, beneath the terror and fatigue, a spark of something human remained. I remembered my name, Kalen Varric, the smell of my mother's cooking, the feel of sun-warmed cobblestones in the town I had called home. But each memory brought pain, reminding me of everything lost. Family slaughtered, friends vanished, freedom stolen. My mind became a battlefield. On one side, the residual humanity clinging desperately to identity, and on the other, the crushing reality of our existence under the Ork hierarchy, hammering me into compliance, shaping me into something unrecognizable. Sleep deprivation and hunger twisted perception. Shadows moved when they should not, and sometimes I swore I could hear the roar of orc engines long after they had passed. I imagined the faces of the knobs, grinning with cruel delight, following me even into the dark corners of my mind. I began to question what was real. Was I still human, or had I become another tool in the endless machinery of the WAC? The nights were the worst. Alone, in the burning glow of scrap fires, I would hallucinate conversations with dead comrades. They accused me of cowardice, whispered secrets of survival, or simply stared at me with vacant eyes. I felt my mind peeling layer by layer, as though each act of forced labor, each scream I had witnessed, and each brutal lash upon a fellow human peeled away the membrane of my identity. Sometimes I would catch myself smiling, or what felt like a smile, at the spectacle of orc violence, and the horror of that realization was greater than the pain of my wounds. I had become efficient, observant, calculating, but in that process I feared I was losing something essential. My humanity was eroding, replaced by fear, adaptation, and mechanical survival. Yet, despite the mental torment, despite the hallucinations and the gnawing hunger, a single thought persisted: survive. One day, one moment, 1 second at a time. Survival was no longer about freedom, it was about being alive long enough to remember, long enough to see the orcs defeated, long enough to hold on to the remnants of Kalen Varric, the man I once was. And that thought, frail and fleeting, became my tether to the human world, the only anchor in a maelstrom of madness. The moment presented itself like a jagged crack in the endless monotony of servitude. A cluster of fellow captives huddled together, whispering of a possible escape through a broken wall on the far side of the camp, beyond the scrap heaps and molten slag pits where the WAC engines roared endlessly. The route was narrow, littered with hazards, and patrolled by orcs at irregular intervals, their senses attuned to even the slightest disruption. One misstep, one accidental clang of metal, and it would mean death, swift, brutal, and complete. The mind raced. Every instinct screamed to flee, to grasp this fleeting chance at freedom, yet a heavy weight pressed down upon the conscience. To leave others behind, to survive while comrades faced slaughter, seemed almost as terrifying as the orcs themselves. Every scenario unfolded in vivid detail. The screams of failure echoing off metal walls, the acrid smoke of burning bodies, the chaotic stampede as the orcs tore through the camp with crude weapons and gleeful malice. It was not just fear of death, it was the moral calculus, the bitter reality of what survival demanded. Loyalty, camaraderie, and compassion were luxuries the orcs did not allow, and yet the human heart clung to them stubbornly. One thought repeated itself with cruel insistence: escape alone and survival is certain but hollow. Stay and others might live, but the chance of perishing alongside them grows exponentially. Every patrol that passed seemed like an oracle, a reminder that time was measured not by clocks but by danger. The orcs' behavior was maddeningly unpredictable. Some knobs would lumber past without noticing, their eyes scanning the horizon only to snap back with deadly attention when least expected. Gretchen scurried around the edges, squealing and colliding with obstacles, their chaos a constant amplification of risk. Even the sound of molten scrap sizzling as it dripped from the WAC machines became a potential harbinger of doom. The body tensed, every nerve alert. Muscles coiled, ready for flight or collapse. But the heart was not so simple. It wavered between instinct and conscience, between the raw, primal urge to survive and the aching knowledge that leaving behind those who had suffered alongside was a betrayal of something deeper than fear itself. The mind replayed images of the beaten, the bloodied, the ones who had whispered hope in quiet corners. Could one truly abandon them, even when the orcs themselves would not hesitate? Time stretched. Moments became eternities as eyes scanned the terrain, counting patrols, noting patterns in the orcs' staggered steps. Every clank of metal, every roar of a mech, every squeal of a Gretchen was magnified, a heartbeat echoing in the chest, reminding that the smallest lapse could spell annihilation. Decisions weighed with an almost physical presence, pressing on shoulders and spine, demanding resolution. In the end, the choice became a crucible, the risk of escape fraught with near certainty of death, versus the quiet, grinding horror of continued servitude. Freedom was a tantalizing promise, but it was drenched in the potential for failure. The chains of fear and morality intertwined, leaving no easy path, only the stark reality that every decision in the Ork war camp came at the price of blood, pain, or conscience. Every flicker of hope, every imagined sunrise beyond the camp walls, was haunted by the knowledge that the Orks themselves did not reason or relent. Their joy was chaos, their punishment capricious, and their patience eternal. To choose wrongly was not merely to fail, it was to disappear, consumed utterly in the crucible of Ork violence. The mind sat at the edge of madness, balancing instinct and morality, knowing that whichever path was taken, survival demanded more than cunning. It demanded ruthlessness of spirit, precision of movement, and a willingness to bear the weight of decisions that could never be undone. And in that crucible, one understood, perhaps for the first time, that survival in a whack. War camp was never simple. It was a test of every fiber of the self, a constant negotiation with fear, conscience, and the merciless reality of life under green-skinned masters. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning promethium and crude lubricants, the metallic tang of blood faintly lingering from previous adjustments the Orks had forced upon fallen captives. The ground beneath trembled in rhythm with the monstrous heartbeat of the war engines that towered above us, hulking contraptions of jagged steel, chains, and engines that seemed barely held together by sheer Ork willpower. Sparks erupted from exposed pistons, molten metal hissed as it dripped onto the scorched earth, and the constant roar of combustion filled the senses, leaving no room for calm, no place for respite. Every day, slaves were herded to the engines, forced to clean the grime from the massive gears, oil the creaking joints, and feed the infernal machines with fuel scavenged from the wreckage of conquered settlements. Hands blistered, backs strained, eyes burned from smoke and heat. The mechanical monstrosities moved with terrifying purpose, rolling over obstacles, crushing debris, and leaving scars in the earth that no human could repair. One misstep, one dropped spanner could bring down a boilerplate arm, flattening whoever stood too close, a punishment meted out not with malice, but with the casual indifference of Ork engineering. The vibration from the engines was relentless. It ran through bones and teeth, through the soles of boots into raw, aching muscles. It was not just the movement of steel, it was the oppressive presence of war itself, a force that reminded every captive of their utter helplessness. The ground quaked under the weight of Gork and Mork's creations, each vibration a message. You are insignificant, you exist to serve, and your life is expendable. And yet, there was an awe-inspiring terror in the sight. The sheer scale of the war engines, the ingenuity of Ork improvisation, half-rusted, half-living contraptions, patched together with scavenged hulls and crude welding, was undeniable. Flames erupted from side vents as if the machines themselves breathed fire. Pistons slammed in rhythm with unseen drums, gears groaned and spun in chaotic synchronization, and massive tires or tracks tore through the scorched earth with deafening crunches. Every engine was a cathedral of Ork violence, a monument to destruction, a living testament to the unstoppable chaos they commanded. The slaves moved like shadows around the monsters, each one acutely aware that a single moment's hesitation could mean death. The heat was suffocating and sweat burned the eyes, mixing with the grime of labor. Every smell, every sound, every tremor reminded them of their powerlessness, reinforcing the bitter truth. In this camp, life was defined not by who survived, but by how efficiently one could feed the engines of war without drawing attention from the green-skinned overseers. Amidst the horror, a silent fear and reluctant admiration intertwined. The machines, as terrifying and crude as they were, represented a scale of destructive capability that no human army could hope to match without coordination and discipline, a coordination the Orks possessed in chaotic abundance. The mind, though strained and exhausted, could not help but marvel at the ingenuity of these monstrosities, even as the body quaked in terror at their proximity. The realization settled in. No matter how fast one moved, how careful or how clever, the engines, and those who commanded them, were indifferent to human suffering. Their purpose was war and human lives were merely fuel. Every morning as the slaves marched to their stations, they carried the weight of this knowledge. Their insignificance measured not in numbers, but in the pounding vibration, the roar, the heat, and the very air that smelled of fire, oil, and blood. Even in moments of brief rest, the rumble of an engine in the distance reminded them that they were never safe. The Orks themselves might be distracted, but the machines never slept. The constant, omnipresent machinery was a reminder of their absolute dependence on these monstrous creations for the Orks' ambitions, and of their complete lack of power to alter their fates. Every beat, every hiss, every spark was a lesson. You are small and you are replaceable. And yet, somehow, despite the terror, the awe of the machines pressed on the mind like a hypnotic drumbeat, imprinting the scale and magnitude of the Ork war effort into the psyche of every human soul trapped within its shadow. The engines did not merely power the Waak. They were the Waak, made flesh and fire. And the slaves, caught in their shadow, understood the full weight of what it meant to exist in the presence of such relentless, incomprehensible power. The camp was a sprawling nightmare of mud, smoke and crude wooden barricades, yet within its chaos small flickers of life persisted. We were broken bodies bound by chains, but even in chains humans sought connection. Small clusters of captives huddled together at night, whispering hurried words beneath the roar of Ork engines. Names, if they had ever meant much, now became symbols of defiance and solidarity. Keep moving, one would hiss. Don't let them see you falter. In those moments, it felt like more than survival. It felt like holding on to a fragment of humanity. Trust was both fragile and essential. To share food or a secret hiding spot was to risk death, yet isolation guaranteed despair. I remember the first time I truly understood the value of these bonds. A young girl, barely 15, had been cornered by a knob who sought amusement in tormenting captives. I shouted a warning and a grizzled laborer, hands scarred, voice hoarse, intercepted her, drawing the knob's ire upon himself. The moment was fleeting, a blur of teeth, metal and shouted curses, but the girl lived. We exchanged nothing more than a nod that night, yet it was a bond stronger than chains, a silent acknowledgement of shared defiance. The emotional toll of these bonds was profound. Friends would vanish, torn from the group for failing the Orks' whims or simply for being convenient targets. One man, loyal and stubborn, had spent weeks secretly sabotaging a mech scrap recycling machine, only to be discovered. I watched from the shadows as the knob twisted him over a fire, his screams echoing across the camp. No one could save him. His sacrifice, though horrifying, sent ripples through our small community, a reminder that survival was not just about the body, but about the choices that defined honor in the smallest ways. Amid the constant fear, camaraderie created moments of stolen hope. During the rare breaks, we would share memories of home, recounting trivial human rituals that seemed absurd now. A meal cooked with care, a laugh shared over a childhood joke, the smell of rain on untamed soil. Those recollections were fragile sparks, burning briefly against the relentless dark of the Ork world. Sometimes they made the chain seem less suffocating, the labor less endless. And yet, heartbreak was ever present. Every bond came with the looming certainty of loss. Orks did not understand friendship. They did not understand mercy. One day, a boy who had become a close ally of mine vanished, dragged away by a war boss for some minor transgression. No screams, no struggle. He simply disappeared into the inferno of the camp. The others and I exchanged only pained glances, the unspoken understanding that we were helpless. But even in despair, we held fast to each other, because to lose all connection was to surrender entirely to the Ork world. Through whispered strategies and shared tasks, we learned to rely on each other for both survival and sanity. Some taught ways to repair the engines quietly to avoid notice. Others showed how to scavenge scraps for food or water. Even small acts, a shared drink, a whispered warning, a brief embrace in the dark, were lifelines. The Orks saw only tools, but in these moments, we were something more. A fragile community that refused to be wholly extinguished. It was in these bonds that I realized the paradox of our existence. Alone, we were prey, dispensable and insignificant. Together, we could carve out slivers of control, fleeting moments of resistance, and perhaps, just perhaps, a chance at survival. But each bond was also a source of constant fear, for attachment made loss unbearable, and every loss etched deeper scars into the soul. Even as the engines roared and the Orks bellowed their crude orders, we clung to each other. We laughed quietly, mourned silently, and endured relentlessly. In the crucible of the Ork war camp, these fragile human connections became a form of quiet rebellion, a testament that even in the darkest oppression, the human spirit could endure. The sun had barely crested the jagged horizon when the camp erupted into chaos. A warbus's bark echoed across the compound, reverberating off scorched timber and twisted metal like the tolling of a death bell. Orks surged forward, their green skins glinting in the orange light, teeth bared in anticipation. Slaves scattered, clutching whatever scraps of clothing or weapons we were allowed to keep, trying to make ourselves small, invisible, hoping that today would not be our last. I pressed my back against the wall of a smoldering workshop, heart hammering, lungs burning. I counted the steps of the approaching Nob, noting the pattern, the shuffle of his boots, the twitch of his fingers. Orks were unpredictable, yes, but in their chaos, there was a cruel rhythm, a consistency that, if one observed carefully, could sometimes be leveraged to survive. The first scream cut through the air. A young man dragged from the line for failing to feed one of the Waak engines on time. His head was slammed against the edge of a molten slag pit before he could even cry out fully. Sparks flew, sizzling flesh, and the metallic stench of scorched blood mingled with the acrid tang of engine oil. Others were being dragged, thrown, or simply crushed under the boots of massive knobs. Every moment was a choice: move or remain frozen, risk notice or risk death. I felt the tightness of my stomach, the bile rising as I watched comrades who had laughed with me only days ago being torn apart in front of everyone. And yet, amidst the horror, my mind worked frantically. I memorized the patrol paths, noted which Nob was slower to react when distracted, which big mech favored one punishment over another. Survival was not luck alone. It was observation, calculation, and a cold acceptance of the brutality surrounding you. Orks did not punish with fairness. They punished with instinct and amusement. One Gretchen tripped over another, and a Nob's boot smashed down without hesitation, ignoring the bloodied body beneath. It was not personal. It was entertainment, tradition, and discipline rolled into one horrifying spectacle. We were prey, and every act of randomness reminded us that none of us mattered, except as fodder to enforce the Ork hierarchy. And yet, I noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts. The Orks' reactions to those who cowered too long, the slight pause when a slave attempted a minor act of cunning, like hiding a scrap of metal or stealing a morsel of food. Those who survived learned quickly, adapting their movements, their posture, their very breathing to the ever-present threat. It was a brutal education, one that came at the cost of innocence, sanity, and the very sense of self. As another scream tore through the air, I found myself thinking of patterns, probabilities, and contingencies. If the patrol came from the north, step behind the pile of molten scrap. If the war boss paused at the engine, freeze entirely, do not breathe. I cataloged every detail, storing strategies for survival alongside memories of faces, friends, neighbors, family, already lost to Ork whimsy. Survival here was not just physical. It was mental, a constant calculation in a theater of unimaginable cruelty. Even amidst the chaos, there was a strange, perverse rhythm. The randomness itself became predictable to a degree. Observing the subtle cues, the slight twitch of a mech's hand, the grunt before a Nob swung his chopper, the pattern in which slaves were dragged from the lines, allowed brief, fleeting moments of agency. You were still prey, but for an instant you could maneuver, anticipate, and sometimes escape the immediate grasp of death. The smell of burning flesh, the metallic tang of blood, the roar of engines and Ork laughter, the pounding of boots on mud and scrap, these were now the backdrop to every thought. And in the center of it all, the mind remained sharp, calculating, alive, holding on to the single flickering thought: survive, adapt, live another day. Every scream, every random execution, every act of Ork cruelty was a lesson. And I took it all in, burning it into memory, not to grow numb, but to endure. Survival demanded total immersion in this alien logic, a cold, precise understanding of violence as a constant, unavoidable law. And perhaps, just perhaps, by learning the rules of this monstrous world, a fragment of humanity could persist, hiding in plain sight among the green tide. The night was thick with smoke, firelight flickering against the jagged steel of the war camp, casting monstrous shadows that danced like specters across the scorched earth. The roar of the Waak had quieted somewhat, as the Orks were distracted by a fresh skirmish at the perimeter, leaving a tenuous, dangerous silence in their wake. I clutched a crude satchel of stolen scraps, tools, rations, anything that might aid our survival, and huddled with the few other humans who had endured the relentless cruelty alongside me. The plan was simple, yet horrifyingly improbable. Slip through the chaos, past the patrols, and vanish into the wasteland beyond the Ork encampment. Every step was a calculated risk. The ground was littered with molten scrap, jagged metal, and the remains of those who had failed to escape before. I forced my breath to stay shallow, feeling the heat of the fires on my back and the vibrations of distant engines under my feet. Each shadow could hide a Nob, each clatter of metal could summon death. My companions mirrored my movements, faces pale, eyes wide with fear, yet burning with a desperate spark of determination. We crawled under a collapsed barricade, the scent of burning oil and charred flesh choking us. One misstep, one misjudged motion, and the nearest knob would have us torn apart for sport. I remembered the patterns, the shuffle of boots, the subtle cadence of orc voices, the rhythm of their chaotic violence. I directed my small band with whispers, guiding them through narrow gaps and over precarious piles of debris. Each successful step was a victory in itself, a small defiance against the relentless oppression of the green tide. Suddenly a shout pierced the air. A lone Gretchen, no doubt curious or foolish, scuttled too close to our path. An orc chortled and raised its massive chopper, teeth glinting. My heart froze, but instinct took over. We flattened ourselves, hearts hammering as the Gretchen barely escaped the swing, squealing in terror. The lesson was immediate. Hesitation was death, but recklessness was equally fatal. We moved past the whack. Engines, their roars and flames casting ominous light over our path. Sparks rained down like deadly hail, and the metal groaned under the immense weight of the massive orc war machines. The air was thick with heat, smoke, and the pungent scent of burnt oil. I could feel my skin crawling, every nerve screaming, yet the thought of freedom, of breathing air not thick with fear, propelled me onward. Hours, or perhaps only minutes, for time had lost meaning in this infernal place, passed as we navigated through the wreckage. One of the group, a wiry man with a scarred cheek, stumbled over a molten scrap pile. A sudden roar from the nearby orcs made my stomach drop. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm, pulling him down just as a knob's boot slammed where his head had been moments before. The taste of copper filled my mouth, not blood, thankfully, but the metallic tang of fear itself. Finally, the outer perimeter approached. The terrain shifted to jagged rocks and scorched earth beyond the camp. The fires of the encampment were behind us, illuminating our gaunt faces, the evidence of suffering etched into our skin. One last patrol, massive even at a distance, threatened to undo everything. I signaled silently, timing our dash with the distraction of an orc brawl erupting nearby. Muscles screaming, lungs burning, we ran. The wind bit at our exposed faces as we crossed the open expanse, every shadow a potential death sentence. Behind us, the camp roared in chaos, orcs shouting, engines roaring, fires exploding, but ahead, there was nothing but the cold, unforgiving wasteland. We didn't speak. No words could capture the relief, the terror, or the exhaustion. When at last we reached a shallow ravine to hide in, I allowed myself a single breath of relief, tasting freedom and loss at once. And yet, even in that fleeting victory, the weight of what we had left behind pressed down. Friends, family, those who had fallen for the chance of survival, they haunted our fleeting sense of triumph. The taste of freedom was bitter, laced with the knowledge that each day beyond the camp would be a struggle, and the orcs would not relent. Survival was not a promise, it was a fleeting spark in a universe ruled by brutality. We huddled in the shadows, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The distant roars of orcs still echoed, a reminder that nothing was truly safe. Yet in that small, trembling moment we were alive. Our chains were broken, if only temporarily, and though the cost had been unimaginably high, the experience left us with a glimmer, a spark that perhaps, against all odds, hope could exist even among the green tide. We crouched in the shadows of the wasteland, bodies pressed against cold, jagged rock, and yet my mind refused to rest. The camp was behind us, but its memory clung like a stench, a permanent mark on our souls. Every scream, every crack of bone, every roar of the whack. Machines replayed endlessly in my thoughts. I had survived, but at what cost? Freedom was a fragile thing. It was not the rush of triumph I had imagined in fleeting moments of hope. It was a heavy, oppressive awareness that each heartbeat could be the last. I had learned the language of survival, how to move silently, how to hide, how to anticipate orc behavior, but those lessons were written in blood, and the price was etched into my very being. The faces of those left behind haunted me, whispering accusations I could neither answer nor silence. What does it mean to survive in a universe where violence is law, and cruelty is entertainment? I no longer recognized the person who had been dragged screaming from the civilian settlement days, or was it weeks? Time had dissolved into a stream of terror, exhaustion, and small, calculated acts of defiance. Every decision to keep moving, to shield another, to fight or flee, had chipped away pieces of my humanity. Yet somehow I remained. I ask myself whether survival here has corrupted me or strengthened me. My body bears the marks of brutality, my mind the weight of constant fear, yet there is a resilience I did not know I possessed. Each narrow escape, each fleeting act of compassion or cunning, has forged a person who knows what it means to endure. But endurance alone is not innocence. The memories of forced participation, of witnessing atrocities I could do nothing to stop, gnaw at the conscience. The line between victim and accomplice blurs in the shadows of survival. And then there is the question of legacy. What does my survival mean? For those who perished, it is nothing. For those who may hear this story, it is a cautionary tale, a glimpse into the machinery of Ork cruelty, the cold calculus of life under domination, and the desperate measures humans take to endure. Perhaps survival alone is a defiance, a silent protest against the universe that would see us crushed. Perhaps it is a warning, a flicker of humanity in a world designed to snuff out such sparks. As I look out across the burned plains, the distant fires of the war camp still glowing like malevolent stars, I realize that the questions will never be answered. There is no closure in the wasteland, no moral certainty, no recompense for those lost. The only truth is existence, raw, unfiltered, terrifying, and fleeting. Survival is not a triumph. It is a testament to human will, fragile and fleeting, yet stubborn against the tide of violence. And so, we move forward, shadows among shadows, carrying the weight of what we have endured. The Orks, the war, the slavery, it shapes us, marks us, and yet does not define the totality of who we are. Every step into the unknown is a question, every breath a defiance. In surviving, perhaps we become more than victims, more than tools. Perhaps we become witnesses, bearing testament to the horror, and, in that act, reclaiming a fragment of what it means to be human. The wasteland stretches endlessly before us, unforgiving and indifferent, and the unanswered questions remain. But even amid the ruin and chaos, the smallest ember of humanity persists, a light against the green tide.